Okay. It is the same day, 2nd of July, 2025, and I am apparently unstoppable today, so I'm going to keep going. Too much coffee, perhaps, but anyway, let's forget that and start talking about what we're talking about, which is the continuation of the essay, Dialectic into Dialogos and the Pragmatics of No-thingness in a Time of Crisis. We're dealing with section 2, which is still formulating the problem, and we're dealing with page number 61. And last time we went through from the third paragraph on page 60 all the way through Kierkegaard's quote about possibilities to spare on page 61. And I'm now continuing from the paragraph that follows Kierkegaard's quotation on possibilities to spare. What we're discussing is what is disclosed within the practice of dialectic into dialogos, and what is disclosed within this paper, what is disclosed by the advent of the sacred in our time that is revealed by the practice or intimated by the practice of dialectic into dialogos. Um, I've connected already. I've made relevant not only the context of nihilism in the context of the meaning crisis, which are explicitly indicated as the relevant context for the discussion of dialectic into dialogos in the paper itself, but I've made relevant also um, the sociological conditions that result from the post-agrarian revolution and the impact of that on our meaning-making structures, that's importantly not just the meaning crisis, but that's a problem at the sociological infrastructural level of the way that we live that is sort of obtained and has been affecting us long before the Axel Revolution, since before the agrarian revolution that I'm saying is relevant. Um, I'm saying then that the meta crisis also is relevant to. So this is sociological and existential context, which is relevant in that I'm bringing to bear on disclosing and uncovering and unpacking what is revealing itself through the practice of dialectic into dialogos that are not made directly relevant as indicated in the paper. Um, so we were talking about Kierkegaard. We were talking about um, a mistake that one can make in defining a lot of different pairs of opposites, differentiating between them, between the nothingness or the nihilism that is disclosed within the practice, or that is the existential practice. Sorry, that is the existential condition that the practice may ameliorate. We're distinguishing between that and theosis, or the metanoia, the spiritual conversion of a recovery of the telos of religious life toward deeper contact with reality that the practice can evoke. And so there's a key distinction between nihilism or nothingness and the equivalent is like theosis or shunyata. So the um, no-thingness rather than nothingness. And we were talking about how Kierkegaard was saying, and sort of also exemplifying and demonstrating how not to steer too strongly into one of the sides, whatever pair of opposites is being talked about. And again, what I'm recommending is to write out the pairs of opposites that get played with during the discussion because they change over time. So I've been in the last video again, we were focusing on necessity versus possibility, especially in Kierkegaard's quote, being versus becoming. Becoming as connected with aspirational development, being connected more with just being as one is. Immanence versus transcendence. Limited and finite versus unlimited and infinite. Down and in to reality versus up and out of reality. Interpersonal and intrapersonal, meaning between people and within the person. And I really added down and in and up and out, and I really added sensory and abstract, and then earth and heaven, whereas the others were more sort of a little bit more explicit in the paper itself. We can see how each of these fit into columns that go together. So I'm going to now list those columns. On the one hand, we have, let's say, the earth column, which is connected with the sensory, the interpersonal, the down and in, the limited or the finite, the immanent, being, and necessity. Whereas the heaven column is more connected with the abstract, with the intrapersonal, with the up and out, with the infinite or unlimited, with the transcendent, with transcendence, with becoming rather than being, and with possibility rather than necessity. And we were talking particularly about the risks that come from veering into one direction rather than um, employing the dialectic and the opponent processing within that dialectic to hold the tension between these different pairs of opposites and steer between the risks that come from going too far to any one side. And the paper was sort of employing Kierkegaard to talk about um, what that risk looks like. What's the concern? What are we trying to avoid here? And that's steering too strongly in one direction. But we were also saying how Kierkegaard sort of caught in a performative contradiction where even in him, even in his perspicacious description of that risk, he's sort of very much demonstrating it in his way of life, where yeah, it's sort of lacking the down to earth qualities, I'm going to say, um, stuck in this intrapersonal loop of relating to oneself and in this synthesis of spirit that focusing on oneself facilitated for Kierkegaard. There's certainly a lot of value in this, which is why it's one half of this whole um, pair of opposites column. But we can also see that it's sort of subject to the sickness unto death, subject to the despair that Kierkegaard was experiencing, because it's a way of yeah, avoiding and escaping the actual rather than the potential. It's a way of getting away from our limited finite selves and lives. And yeah, so we can indicate all of these risks in the philosophy. We can indicate them all in the paper and in our discussion. But unless we're actually following the advice, following the wisdom that we find, following the insights that we derive from that, then we're kind of stuck in this performative contradiction where it's all very well to describe the risk here, but if in that describing we spend our whole life describing and we avoid the real world, well, then it doesn't go very well, either for us and the world. And so I have this, yes, this general orientation to, um, as is explicated in the paper, steering away from the risks that come from abstracting and from going up and out. And I'm trying to focus on the here and now. I'm not, it takes a lot of work, it, because I'm trying to bridge the gap by taking this abstract, heady, philosophical stuff and bringing it down, bringing it down to the ground. And I'm doing my best. It's not easy because literally having to go sentence by sentence and unpack the meaning of individual words um, because it's fun and I like it. But I don't want to spend my life doing this. It's a component of a life, but I'm dependent on the world around me for the freedom that allows me to do this. And that freedom is exactly what's in jeopardy as per the meta crisis. And yeah, so it's just if I were just doing this for my whole life, that would not be constitutive of a meaningful life. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, and I want to say that for others as well, I guess. Anyway, that's sort of coming again. I'm drawing there from um, sociological critiques that I've made in the discussion of Jung's psychological types and elsewhere, saying that as per Jung's general diagnosis, we are too differentiated into our different functions, both sociologically and psychologically, socially and internally. We're split off from our roots. We're cut off from the roots of who we are, and that practically that means like loss of shamanism, loss of social unity, loss of coherence and integration, both internally and externally. Yet loss of access to the logos, loss of access to mystical experience, loss of access to the constitutive elements of meaning in life, um, which are deeply dependent on not just ecologies of practices, but community and community in place. uh, place is governed by the law of the land and what we need to do to live, thrive, and survive in that land, um, which transformational philosophical practices may fit into, but those practices are themselves deeply dependent on uh, all of that. Yeah, and so the risk there is that if we just sort of spend all of our time doing dialectic into dialogos while the meta crisis sweeps over the world, then this is kind of for me this is sort of diddling while Rome burns. And sort of it's like an analogy that I like to use is imagine that you wake up in the Library of Alexandria and you start to smell some smoke. And imagine that there are some like people next to you, philosopher types, let's say, and they hand you a book and they say, this is a really good book. Like you should really read this one. It's like, I don't know. Um, it's Saint Augustine and his Confessions. And it's really relevant to your situation and maybe it is, and but it's kind of like, hang on, I can kind of smell some smoke and I'd love to sit down and read that book that you've got over there, but do you want to we attend to the situation here? And there's like, and then they're like, oh yeah, man, but there's this other book which is like it's really good and it's Um, I'm looking at one over there, which is Finite and Infinite Games by James Cass. And it's like, yeah, I kind of already read that and I got some of it. It's like, well, I got to go back to it at some point. But it's like, well, yeah, the fire is getting hotter. And we should, it's kind of like, I'd love to, I'd love to read all of the books that John talks about, but it's like, there's a kind of like he's employed as a philosopher so that he can communicate all that stuff so that I don't have to go and read it all, even though I would very much like to. And this is why I have stacks of it all lying around because I'm trying. But it's kind of like, it's got to be beholden to actuality. And that's what I'm trying to point out and orient to and work toward. And we can see that in terms of our current present existential situation and the risk and in the risk that Kierkegaard orients us towards. And I'm constantly going to be attuned to that and talking about that through this because and I think I'm well justified in doing that because if nothing else, then making it more available and accessible and democratic. I mean, maybe I'm not doing that. Maybe I'm just, maybe this is completely esoteric and for what it's worth, it's clarifying me and bringing me back down to the ground. So, believe it or not. Anyway, so we're going to continue. So I did list the sets of opposites that we were working with, and we're going to go from that point. So as I said, we're starting from after Kierkegaard talking about possibilities despair, which is a sort of corruption of aspirational development toward self-transcendence and away from immanence, toward the possible away from the necessary. And again, there's a talk of place in that context. And I made the argument that it's not just that we become ourselves from some place, existentially speaking, but literally, as in physically, some place on the earth as well. Um, you know, but much as a come down as that is for the philosopher, but we are actually all in places. And the reason for bringing that up now is because we're going to go talk about place some more. So this big paragraph that we can see on page 61 begins, as we will argue, the dialectic of no-thingness exercised in Dialogos articulates that place for the becoming of the self, the dialectic resolution of its dichotomous aspects. In so doing, it can respond to the disorientation that fells the metanoetic project. Okay, I'm going to take those two together. So what are we talking about there? So we're talking about, yeah, again, Kierkegaard's difference between just becoming, which is sort of going away from the beginning point, versus becoming oneself is a movement that happens at that place. So I use the hero's journey. So if one's becoming oneself, then there's a going away from the community, the beginning place, but then there's also a return to that place, which is kind of equivalent to saying becoming oneself is a movement at that place. It's from somewhere, it ends up back there. Um, and when it's becoming oneself, one can transcend oneself, but then one comes back down to one's finite self. And so then it's a place that place from which we go out and come back. It's a place from which to go out and come back to. And so again, we can see from this beginning sentences here, as we will argue, this is at the propositional level. I'm saying again that there's more disclosed beneath the level of argument, beneath the level of proposition. So the dialectic of nothingness Yeah, which is exercised in Dialogos. So again, there's this dialogue, this dialectic between the no-thingness. So the dialectic of no-thingness means that there's a quality of no-thingness, which is a fullness and abundance, connected with theosis and metanoia, um, that is disclosed at different levels within the practice. It's disclosed within our self-identity, but it's also disclosed within the self-identity of reality. So this the self-realization of reality, as well as the self-realization of us as individuals. And that sort of also corresponds to self-realization at the individual sort of personal level and at the collective sort of level of the Geist, the we space, the shared presence. And there's a no-thingness which is evoked in all of those places at once in the dialectic. So the idea here is that that happening is the articulation of that place for the becoming of the self. So the idea here is that there, again, this is where it's so abstract and it gets quite difficult to comprehend. And so we are dealing with ultimately my interpretation of what this means, and that's okay too. So there's a sense here that I have that this again, this dialectic between these different levels of our identity, um, in the interpersonal context, let's say in the dialectic into dialogos practice, there's a no-thingness which is disclosed, and that looks like a kind of feels like a kind of emptying out, like there's a space that's been created that was previously full. Um, and so there's a sense of getting out of the way, like a clearing, the act of clearing space. And so the idea is that that dialectic, there's an articulating of the place that Kierkegaard felt is important for becoming oneself. And so there's a distinction here between the clearing of the place, so the making available of the place, and then the becoming of the self, which is a separate step that happens after the clearing of the place. Um, yeah, so the important point there is that this disclosure of emptiness, this clearing of the space, is not itself the metanoia. So um, there's a becoming of the self, which is it's implied that yeah, the articulation of that place or the clearing of an empty space is not the becoming of the self. The becoming of the self is possible. So is the metanoia, and by metanoia again we mean sorry, just finding that by metanoia, we mean, yeah, changing one's way of life resulting from penitence or spiritual conversion. So there's an idea that, um, I mean, it's not exactly clear, right? Because the other implication would be that the alternative, I'm saying, would be that the dialectic of no-thingness exercised in Dialogos is itself the metanoia, the conversion. And that may well have been part of what they said earlier. Um, they said, and I quote from page 60, it was that difficult line. This paper will offer dialectic as a philosophy whose form of life responds to nihilism by restoring the phenomenal functional telos of religious life, a metanoia, whereby turning to no-thingness is the realization of being in the non-being of oneself and the realization of being in the non-being of reality. So it's not entirely clear, and I think as we go into the paper, we're sort of exploring more of the dimensions of this, and um, I will try to indicate when there's what I feel is lack of clarity, which may just have to do with the limits of my own understanding of this. So we can see from that quote that there's a sense that there's a turn toward no-thingness, and that is, in that sentence, equivalent to the realization of being in non-being. But here, in this later section that we were dealing with in page 61, it seemed to indicate that the um, articulation of the place from which we like the place of emptiness, so the dialectic of nothingness, um, the dialectic of nothingness kind of articulates that place. Um, and the idea is so that the becoming of the self can arise. So it implies that those are not the same action, so that something needs to be done for the self to arise beyond the articulating of that place. Um, so that feels sufficient. So we're going to try and work out which of those is the case. So I've written that this articulates this is a critical juncture. This is back to the self about place. So I've said that dialectic into Dialogos can only do this properly, articulating this place, if it's willing to fully incorporate an awareness of 3D boots on the ground physical reality, i.e., grappling with an awareness of the meta crisis, not just meaning crisis. This acts as a forcing function on the worldview and existential situation slash involvement of the participants, which is the precondition for genuinely viable collective transformation. We must realize non-being, not in the abstract philosophical or even personal existential sense, but in the sense of imminent and impending collective self-induced suicide. We must fully articulate that place, which is to say, make certain that we found the right launch pad from which to blast off before we implode. If the practice cannot do this, it's just a sophisticated form of hedonism, fiddling while Rome burns. Yeah, and I mean, I know that's kind of all that might not be clear. I kind of packed a lot into that little note that I wrote there, but yeah, I guess I'm arguing there that the um because there's claims being made about what dialectic into Dialogos does, and I'm saying um I think there are conditions on that. I'm saying it can only do what we're claiming that it can do if we are beholden to the existential situation. And I realize that I'm saying my sense of the existential situation is the one that's correct, and that other people may see reality in a different way. Um, I think I want to say about that um, we can at least I wouldn't want to say that dialectic into dialogos is and what is disclosed by it is for the purpose of solving the meta crisis. In fact, I would regard that as a mistake, a form of idolatry. But I might imagine that outcome somehow, or at least contributing to that response to the meta crisis as a side effect. And so I can imagine that this practice of dialectic into dialogus can have interest and utility and lots of, we can keep exploring it for generations, right? But if we all die in the meantime, frankly, then I don't see how it's relevant. Um, yeah, so I'm saying that like because we're talking about, and I guess technically speaking, we're talking about transformative experience. We're talking about connecting ourselves with uh, a second self interpersonally. We're talking about connecting with a higher sense of self, which is sort of emerging through us. And if that transformative experience is to uh, if we're able to fully engage, fully give ourselves to that transformative experience, there are certain conditions on that. If it's to work properly, what I'm saying is that if like a transformative experience, a good example of that is vomiting. You can't stop halfway through, and it's a kind of there's a full commitment which is required for it. You have to go fully into the self transformation for it to work properly. And I'm saying that the existential awareness, the situational awareness of the participants is a precondition for the uh, depths of disclosure that are revealed by the practice. Um, so I'm saying that unless we're able to fully give ourselves to what that is in an existential sense, as if our life depended on it, because it does, um, then unless we can do that, then it doesn't, I don't think it works properly. Um, or I don't think it can meet the claims that are being made. Um, yeah, so this is about fully clearing the place. So if it is articulating that place, imagine that it's like imagine that Elon Musk is going to Mars and he wants to launch a rocket, right? Well, it's pretty important to make sure that the launch pad is cleared before blast off, because if the launch pad is not cleared properly before blast off, then it might uh, affect the blast off. It might not work properly. It might blow up the rocket. Um, Another analogy to use would be if we're preparing to give birth to a baby, if we're like in the position of spiritual midwives or real midwives, let's say, then you better make sure you have everything ready and you're paying full attention and you're sort of your full attention locked on to the situation as it is. Um, and that, yeah, it brings us out of, it's not just a fun extracurricular philosophical practice, right? It's also not just for it's not just for sort of sophisticated hedonism. It's not just to satisfy the philosophical, the sense of, I enjoy talking with other people about ideas or whatever. It's like it's we can't just come to it from a place of hedonism. It's not going to work properly if we're doing that. And frankly, I've been noticing so many people doing that, that it's just that's not at all why we should be there, because it forecloses personal transformation. It forecloses the transformative experience that we require in the sense of self one to self two, aspirational development, transformative experience is required, and we have to enter into it fully for it to work properly. We have to give ourselves to it fully. Okay, that might do for that. Yeah, so again, it's implied in the sentence that the becoming of the self follows afterwards of the clearing, the articulating of that place. So this dialectic of nothingness does not itself constitute the metanoia. It sets the stage for that metanoia, is the implication. The dialectic resolution of its dichotomous aspects. Um, Again, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that the resolution is reached. Um, so there's two senses of resolution. One is that we get more clear within the dialectic of these dichotomous aspects of the self, let's say, but and that might be totally possible. Um, the alternative would be that in the dialectic, the different aspects of the self get confused and they don't get more resolved. They get obscured, and I think there are risks of that. If someone gets too personally invested in it, or if one is not invested enough, then it may end up in a confusion. And alternatively, there's a sense of resolution at the end rather than during the practice, at the end of the practice. So I'm not convinced that there's a resolution of the dichotomous aspects, because we just leave the dialogue. It doesn't get resolved. It's sort of left open, left so just to say I'm not sure that we do actually reach resolution, but that's okay. Maybe we can just say we attempt for there to be more resolution than less. And that seems to be a good thing. Unless by resolution we mean finishing, in which case, no, we probably want to take it up again at some point rather than stop somewhere. So yeah, in so doing, it can respond to the disorientation that fells the metanoetic process. Metanoetic meaning a way of doing philosophy that understands the limits of reason. Um, yeah, so there's a sense of kind of responding to the 20th century and 19th century end of philosophy, in the sense of we've understood the limits of reason and we don't know where to go from here, sort of postmodernism and nihilism being a sort of dead end. And there's a way that this practice is supposed to respond to the disorientation which is engendered by that dead end, by that metanoetic project in philosophy. So that was, as we will argue, the dialectic of no-thingness exercised in Dialogos articulates that place for the becoming of the self, the dialectic resolution of its dichotomous aspects. In so doing, it can respond to the disorientation that fells the metanoetic project. For Kierkegaard, the condition of despairing over oneself must be understood dialectically, and so must its resolution. Just to say there's a sense of despairing over oneself. an in sense of possibilities to spare, going too much into the transcendent, to the infinite, to the up and out. It's quite literally a despairing over oneself, not being with who one really is on the ground, but sort of falling over, going too high, going over the top. Um, so for Kierkegaard, the condition of despairing over oneself must be understood dialectically, and so must its resolution. So sort of explicating what Kierkegaard is up to. So, despite traditional charges of radical individualism, there's a distinct dialogic presence in Kierkegaard's teleology of selfhood, a relation to another whose ontological grounding resolves the dialectic of an individual's opponent process. Okay. Yeah, so this is explicating a bit, what Kierkegaard is really up to. And again, Kierkegaard is in this intrapersonal dialectical engagement with a presence within himself, akin to Socrates' daemon, akin to Jung's anima, akin to John and Hermes. And so this is what the authors are using to push back on Kierkegaard as an individualist, because it's like, no, he's dialoguing with someone in there. And I guess like the updated criticism would be, yeah, but he's only doing it intrapersonally. He doesn't have enough facility with the interpersonal to come down into the world, which is why he's subject to the sickness unto death. Um, but anyway, on this dialogic presence that Kierkegaard is engaged with in his teleology of selfhood toward clarifying and resolving oneself by being in engagement with this dialogic presence and constructing a meta-narrative that binds these different senses of selfhood. Um, there's a relation to another. And I think this word for me, another, it sort of evokes the sense of the self, the Jungian self. It's a sort of higher self in a way, the new center of personality, if you like, but also of the shadow, where the other is really someone that we project upon. We see the strangeness of another. Um, Another is actually a quote, I guess, from Kierkegaard, and so. There's a key quality of that other with that Kierkegaard is in relation with intrapersonally in dialectic. And the key is that that other has an ontological grounding. And so again, in Jung, this is the idea that the anima with whom Jung is in dialogue is has direct access to the unconscious and to the self as the center of the new personality which is emerging. So there's a privileging of the anima of the dialogical partner. They have a certain access to reality. Namely, again, we're talking about ontotheology, so both being and God connected together. So, like for Jung, again, it's like the dialogue with the anima gives sort of privileged access to the emerging center of personality, which Jung regards as God. And in Kierkegaard, is the sort of this relation to another. That other has an ontological grounding that is so there's a way that in Kierkegaard's terms, let's say, so God is accessed by that ontological grounding is accessed by this dialectic with another within himself. And so this, yeah, that ontological grounding of the other, it resolves the dialectic of an individual's opponent process, since the other is grounded in God, is what I've written. So there's a way that the resolution of the internal dialectic with another in Kierkegaard, or with the anima in Jung, or with Hermes in John. It's the ontological grounding of that other which resolves the dialectic. Yeah, that's fine for me. So I hope that makes some kind of sense. Yes, and for Kierkegaard, of course, this presence has a distinctly Christian character. I guess to answer that, it would be sort of like, okay, we can do this dialectic opponent processing thing, and we can do it intrapersonally and interpersonally. And interpersonally, we sort of get a sense of resolution both in the dialectic, in discovering this shared mutual grounding in the Geist or the we space, and we also get a sense of resolution at the end of the dialectic, namely when we stop talking to each other. But how does that resolution show up intrapersonally, in dialectic with oneself, with the higher self, the sacred second self, with the divine double, with the, all these different characters? that we can choose between, let's say, or however it shows up. And the answer is that it's the ontological grounding of that self, which constitutes the resolution within an individual's opponent process. And for Kierkegaard, of course, that presence has a distinctly Christian character. Stephen Evans notes that while Kierkegaard frequently refers to Socrates as his teacher, he believes in Christ and sees faith in the latter, in Christ, as the formal response to the despair. So Kierkegaard sees faith in Christ as the formal response to the despair made conscious by Socratic irony. I don't have much to say about that at the moment. So it goes on. The agapic capacity to love one's neighbor or undertake any such works of spirit requires an inward movement to internalize the pattern of Christ as a paradox of actuality. This paradox ameliorates possibilities to despair by marriage to necessity. Okay, what does this mean? So I'm going to quickly define agape, which is talked about again. There's episodes in Awakening the Meaning Crisis on this. So um, yeah, obviously it's a form of love from the Greek. It's like a Christian love, let's say. It's connected to the Buddhist compassion, to empathy. Love thy neighbor. It's this kind of love. It's not concerned with oneself, so it's kind of selfless love. It's not sexual, so it's not to do with eros, and it's also not to do with philia. Um, Unconditional, unending, all-encompassing, beautiful, radiant, majestic love. Yeah, I think Christian love for thy neighbor is a pretty good way of getting at it. It's also the love, agapic love is the love of a mother for its child. It's the love by which the child becomes a person. Um, there's more on that in John's episode on agape and Christianity, which I would highly recommend. So that lets us to say this agapic capacity to love one's neighbor. Yeah. So they're sort of explicating the implication of Kierkegaard. So where, the Christian recommendation is, love thy neighbor and they're saying that sort of to do that or undertake any works of spirit, um, what's required for that? And the implication of Kierkegaard is that what's required is an internal movement and a dialogue within oneself. And it's a dialogue specifically to internalize the pattern of Christ. And so this is, yeah, connected with metacognition. Um, so it's connected with internalizing the sage. It's connected with this dialectical. What I mean is cognition about cognition, so reflecting on our reflecting, and the idea of taking out the perspective of the sage, for example, Christ, taking out the perspective of this higher self. What can it allow? Well, an example of that is it allows us to internalize the sage, internalize the pattern of Christ, and doing so, um, that's an inward movement. It's an inner dialectic, and that allows us to access this agapic capacity. So it's a way of, like, you could say, channeling Christ. It's like by being in this dialectic with Christ as an example, or with Socrates or whoever else, the soul, whatever. This is sort of the qualities can be made more present. Why is it a paradox of actuality? Um, I don't know why it's a paradox. What else have I said? I've said that this paradox ameliorates possibilities to despair by marriage to necessity. That's what they've said. So what have I said about that? So yeah, there's a way that there's a connection between the actual love of one's neighbor, the recommendation to bring Christ to bear in the world, right? And we're using Christ as an example because we're talking about Kierkegaard. So it's this the purpose of the inner dialectic with one's higher self, with Christ, let's say, is to bring that to be present actually, and it ameliorates possibilities to despair by marrying that inner possibility to necessity, namely the necessity to love thy neighbor, which, yes, ameliorates possibilities to despair, as discussed in the last video. I've written as well that sort of, yeah, these Christian values. It's very much, when we talk about love thy neighbor, it's very much down and in rather than up and out. It's a sense of good old fashioned about family virtues and internalizing the sage, which is a sense of there's a sense of conservation. It's a conservative sense rather than progressing up and away. It's sort of down and in and among. Sense of immanence. It's orientation toward the local participation rather than global abstraction or non-participation. So it involves like real works of spirit that require spiritual at-one-ment, atonement, that require that at-one-ment by indwelling Christ as a living symbol. So if one can allow the living symbol of Christ to dwell within one, then one can atone. This is in Christian terminology, right? One can atone for one's sin and sort of thereby actualizing Christ's life in the kingdom of God on earth, sort of by acting as if that kingdom of God is within us. Then that can actually come to be present. So there's a way that by sort of acting as if, by doing this inner dialogue and acting as if the kingdom of God is within us, which via self-recognition it actually is, this allows it to manifest in the world. Yeah, so there's a way, it's paradoxical because it's kind of, there's a self-recognition of one's inner divinity. There's an inner possibility and an inner sagehood. There are perspectives of the sage that are available to one. And self-recognizing oneself as that, paradoxically, allows that to manifest in the world through us, which is why Christ is a living symbol as someone to participate in, which is kind of the whole point of Christ, which kind of, yeah, defeats the purpose of taking him literally as this. Anyway, I'm not going to go on with that. Yeah, I think I've written that it's also an appeal or a request, the sentence. So like where there's a way that the paper is trying to disclose something, and there's a way that unless we can internalize the pattern of the paper, um, we can't really understand what is going on in it. Um, leave that behind. So yeah, the paradox ameliorates possibilities to spare by marriage to necessity. Yeah, by actualizing these virtues in the world by virtue of this inner dialectic. Yeah. What would be the alternative to that? It would be an infinitizing movement away from the Earth, which is like Elon going to Mars. So this again, this away from this place, this Earth, but again, it's like up toward the abstract, toward the philosophical, not down and among. An infinitizing movement away from the Earth, where the abyssal imagination runs amok, will simultaneously become the movement to refinitize. And in this bidirectional movement, the self comes to be grounded transparently in the power that established it. Yeah, so there is a sense of the virtue of this infinitizing movement. So it's allowing oneself to be in this inner dialectic with one's higher self. And this is an infinitizing movement internally. And there's an idea that can be the abyssal imagination run amok if taken too far, which I've sort of elaborated on as sort of techno-utopianism as an example, is a kind of self-destructive escapist form of nihilism in sci-fi clothing, where they're sort of, yeah, denying the reality of their lives and our lives here on the earth and sort of running away into this self-destructive escapist form of nihilism. Yeah, running away from the inner hollowness of the modern condition. And so there's an idea here that this movement will simultaneously become a movement to refinitize. So I wanted to talk about will here, the word will simultaneously. And so the idea is that it will become that, this simultaneous movement to refinitize, if the dialectic is present alongside at least for Kierkegaard, the leap of faith into the ontological grounding of the transcendent other. That's kind of Kierkegaard's leap of faith, I think, is that the ontological grounding of the other, of Christ or of the soul in Jung or of the daemon in Socrates or whatever. Like it's the again, there's a sort of leap of faith which is trusting the ontological ground of the other, and um, it's that trust, that leap of faith, which alongside the inner dialectic that we're having with that figure that allows then the movement to refinitize, to come back down and in and among. Yeah, where there's a sort of if there's a insecurity about the ontological grounding of the other, there may be this always this focus of getting toward that ground and trying to find that ground and not really being able to be here, but always trying to get towards something which we can never find, which we can never ground ourselves in. Yep. So and this so that leads to a bi-directional movement where the idea here is not to fall on the hard middle ground where the seed would lie fallow on the rocks, but instead to both infinitize and finitize in dialectical tension. So there's this opponent processing in the dialectic, this is internally, intrapersonally. So where there's a movement toward infinity and towards internalizing the pattern of Christ, and then actualizing the Christian love of thy neighbor, bringing it finitizing, so bringing it down and in and among the world. And this opponent processing, um, the, um, via this opponent processing, these processes, so these different directions, they sort of encourage and impel each other. And this is sort of yeah, you can see me doing this dynamic wheel that develops where they mutually afford each other and push each other along, even though they're going in opposing directions. Again, so this is again simultaneous movement towards infinitizing and finitizing toward the transcendent and towards the finite that Kierkegaard is talking about here. And the idea is that within that opponent processing bidirectional movement, what happens to the self? Because the key question for Kierkegaard was, yeah, what happens to the self in that? And the idea is the self comes to be grounded transparently in the power that established it, which just speaks to the trusting in the ontological grounding of the other. It's like what we mean by ontological grounding is that that actually is us. That's actually who we are. Um, yes, and we're grounded transparently. So there's a very real sense, as we were talking earlier about this no-thingness, right? So there's an emptying out of the self. In a very real sense, the self disappears, and there's an idea that both directions are required for this sort of vanishing act. So here, the idea would be that yeah. So what I'm imagining an image that's going to help us to clarify what I mean by this. So yeah, imagine two screens, and they're sort of circular and they're kind of dirty or obscured, so opaque. And when they are perfectly aligned with each other, when they're fitting exactly over the top of each other, then they become clear. Um, and when they become clear, they're transparent, literally, and that affords the possibility for something to move through them. Um, so that's exactly what we see in Kierkegaard, where this internalization of the pattern of Christ in the internal dialectic and um, the internalization of the pattern of Christ and the trusting in the ontological grounding of uh, that inner other, um, those actions allow for the agapic love to flow through, because what I mean here is that there's this narrative created of who one is, where one's meta-narrative identity ends up being this combination of identity of this higher self and one's limited mortal finite self. And it is by the um, creating of transparency, like the grounding of oneself in that higher other, let's say, is also making oneself transparent to the power of that other, the power that established it. And that making oneself transparent is a kind of vanishing act. Um, yes, that allows, in the Christian sense, agapic love to flow through one into the world. Or allows, yes, it allows some power to act through one. Yeah, where the idea is that grounding oneself in a certain power, right? And the idea is that that power can then act through us with more facility if we sort of get ourselves out of the way. So if we can, yeah, realize this inner dialectic, this inner, yes, we're talking about intrapersonally here. So if we can realize this inner dialectic and create a new meta narrative, a story about who we are that is a combination of this going up towards transcendence and down towards infinity, then we can ground the self in transparently in the power that established us and that allows that power to be more actualize itself in the world and through us. Yeah, so it's a really important connection between not only higher and lower self, and not only the meta narrative that binds that together in a new way, but also the transparency of self that is disclosed in that relationship and the affordance that comes from that transparency, namely power to act in the world. Um, yeah, even and especially in a time of crisis, I might add. Yeah, and importantly, as I've said, both directions, sort of the whole system is required for the transparency to um, show up, to be there. And to the degree that there is not transparency, something's getting in the way. So there's too strong a movement to some direction or other. We're identifying with some material which is not allowing us to empty ourselves, and so not allowing something else to flow through us. Yeah, one of the questions I have about that um, sentence is how to avoid possession in that condition. So there's a question of what of the will, like because there's an idea that like as we make ourselves more transparent for that power to flow through us, what happens to our agency? And because there's a sort of trusting leap of faith, and one had better be sure that one's created a good enough relationship with a power that is hopefully benign. Um, and so that's just more of a throwaway question, but the idea that that process could very much be weaponized or misused by creating a dialectical relationship with something other than a sage that did not have benign intent. Okay, and so we're going to move to the next sentence, trying to get through this paragraph. So that paragraph was, to restate, and we're talking about Kierkegaard. I'm going to do a few sentences. The agapic capacity to love one's neighbour, or to undertake any such works of spirit, requires an inward movement to internalize the pattern of Christ as a paradox of actuality. This paradox ameliorates possibilities to spare by marriage to necessity, an infinitizing movement away from the earth, where the abyssal imagination runs amok, will simultaneously become the movement to refinitize. And this bidirectional movement and in this bidirectional movement, the self comes to be grounded transparently in the power that established it. I can just mention in passing the double sense of the word power that I talked about last time, where power sort of means, yeah, power to act in the world, power that's connected with purpose, skill, knowing how, and narrative order. But moving on, Kierkegaard analogizes this transparency by describing how a body acclimates to a draft by resolving contradictory sensations, or how consonants and vowels, when fitted together properly, disappear as they resolve into discourse. Okay, so Kierkegaard's using some analogies, and why is he using analogies? To talk about this transparency. So there's a sense of transparency that seems to be evoked by this opponent processing between finitizing and infinitizing. That's again happening in internal dialectic, creates a transparency, and Kierkegaard's trying to give analogies of this transparency to give us a sense of it. So one analogy is the body acclimates to a draft by resolving contradictory sensations. So I actually didn't know that. So there's a sense that if there's a draft that's present, the body can sort of adjust to it, and it does that in some way. like meaning a draft of wind. Um, so the body adjusts to the draft of wind in a room, let's say, by resolving contradictory sensations. And what I wanted to say about that is that can obviously the implication is also contradictions in the stream of the paper. So I'm saying that there is a body which is present beneath the level of propositions that is uh, attempting to resolve contradictory sensations that are coming through the articulating, namely in me and also in the paper itself. And so this is again this debriding that I'm talking about, where the paper is sort of participating in nihilism and also participating in theosis or nothingness and no-thingness. And the body that is present is acclimating to that by resolving these contradictory sensations into one. And that is an analogy of the transparency, where it's like that act of resolving the contradictory sensations. So there's like mixed messages in the paper and or in my speaking, and those are resolved by the body, which is understanding it, let's say, and that resolution is akin to the transparency. Yeah. How is it akin to the transparency? It's kind of like in terms of the body, like if we look at it in terms of making sense of contradictory sensations in the paper, well, it yields meaning still. It still has meaning. So we can resolve these contradictions. It's okay. It's still meaningful. And in this transparent power, it's sort of like, yes, we can be moving towards infinity and moving towards finitude. And this is still we can resolve that. And by resolve that, we mean get clear. Sorry, we get clear understanding, but also clear as in transparent to the self. So there's nothing that's blocking, nothing that's we're not misunderstanding or objecting or getting stuck anywhere. So there's another analogy, or how consonants and vowels, when fitted together properly, disappear as they resolve into discourse. Yeah, so there's like we're obviously using consonants and vowels within the structure of these sentences, and when they're fitted together properly, they disappear so that we can understand. So understanding, clear understanding is the result, is an analogy of the clear transparency that results from what Kierkegaard's up to. So I got some um, analogies of my own. So sort of imagine a ball which is being thrown. Imagine throwing a ball through many rings. And so you kind of want those rings, these different rings, to be all lined up um, in hoops, let's say, all in just the right way, such that when the ball is thrown, it can go through all of them without hitting any of the edges. Um, Alternatively, imagine imagine a water geyser. Imagine, we see these in the real world. These I forget what they're called, sort of yeah, there's I don't know what's the name for that. I forgot. It's gone straight out of my head for the minute. But like, yeah, a water geyser, which is like near the coast, as in near the ocean. It's like real in the world, and they sort of go like they. I forget what the name for this is. Anyway, they and it's kind of like it happens at a predictable rate every so often, like every minute or something, when the wave comes back. And imagine that we think, imagine that we're standing over the top of one of those, and that we think that it's going to um spurt. We think that it's going to blow soon. And imagine that while we're doing that, we're preparing many um, hovering, fragile glass sculptural hoops. So imagine that we have these glass rings which are sort of arrayed over this water geyser, and we're trying to arrange them just so, because they're so fragile, such that the passage of the water geyser will not destroy them, but will instead pass through cleanly. Um, then imagine that those glass rings are sort of aspects of the personality, components of the personality, and that we're hoping that uh, the power of God acting in the world through us is not going to burn us to a crisp as it does so. Um, Roughly speaking, that's what we're hoping to achieve. And then I think the alternative would be there that it's not until we get all of them completely aligned that transparency can be sort of achieved. And the water geyser will go, to use that analogy. So sort of the right alignment is as a prerequisite for it to work, for it to go. And so the to follow that through would be we need hypo subjects, selfless beings, to afford the emergence of a higher self. So we need to sort of empty ourselves out. I think that's kenosis. I keep forgetting which one it is, but I think it's kenosis. This is a self-emptying, emptying out of oneself to sort of get out of the way, to cultivate this transparency such that something can pass through us from that deeper ontological ground, sort of all implied in these analogies and sentences. Yeah, so we're using these analogies, or how consonants and vowels, when fitted together properly, disappear as they resolve into discourse. It then says, in the same way, the syntax of selfhood stereoscopes. See further ahead. When it is spoken aloud to another, a thou, who hears it singularly, whose transcendent measure of possibility potentiates the dialectic of self into becoming itself by becoming intelligible to itself. Okay, what does this mean? So it's kind of another analogy. It's another way to try to describe the same thing. And again, this is sort of what is what's the purpose of this uh, internal dialectic, this opponent processing dynamic? What is the result of that? What happens? Um, and there's a sense of selfhood becoming transparent, and that facilitating the passage of a certain power, that may be useful and important. We're trying to describe that process, and they're doing so in a philosophical way that's difficult to understand, that I'm trying to bring down to earth so that it can be useful. Because otherwise, I don't think it's really relevant, to be honest. Anyway, it says, in the same way as the analogies, the syntax of selfhood stereoscopes. What do we mean by that? So, define syntax, yeah, is like the arrangement of words and phrases to create well-formed sentences in a language. So the syntax of selfhood might be sort of like the structural elements of our self, um, stereoscopes. That basically means narrows, I think, but I'm going to define it. Yeah, again, it's perspectival stereoscopy that we were talking about earlier, where two images give a slightly different, but give an impression of depth. So when we say syntax of selfhood stereoscopes, um, there's a way that the dimensions of oneself, the aspects of oneself, including those that are finite and transcendent and all the rest of it, all the different dimensions of oneself, these um, these converge or point to um, a a different reality. So they allow for the passage of something by this pointing. So there's a way that yeah, all these different aspects of oneself, they sort of converge in a certain way, which makes them clear to one another. Ooh, okay, so it said when, so that happens when it's spoken to another. Ooh, so we can see how this is like I'm speaking to another here, right? And so, and I'm also speaking aloud. So I'm actually trying to do here is to make myself clear. I'm actually trying in this articulating to, gosh, I'm just taking that in for a second. Because it's actually been implicit in what I've been trying to do the whole time. I didn't realize that. This is what I mean by it can sort of affect me existentially. Um, to me, the listening here is the other who's hearing it singularly. Damn, I didn't realize that. So I'm just sort of gonna keep going. So Yes, by articulating all of this, I'm hoping to reveal myself. I'm hoping to clarify myself, articulate myself, to make myself transparent. Um, there's a way that this, importantly to say in passing, that this, when it says in brackets, see further ahead, this can be read, see more deeply. So, there's a way that this sentence is speaking to us. It's, so it's trying to evoke this quality within the reader, I would say. So this is, we can see that there's a sort of hit another level, another layer here, which is sort of evoked in this see further ahead. It also means read more deeply. And so, in the same way, the syntax of selfhood stereoscopes read more deeply when it is spoken to another, a thou. So, for this process to work, I really have to regard the listening as the thou, as the other. And I do. I mean, I don't just, I really do believe that at the moment. So, an analogy to this is sort of when we articulate who we are to other people, we we triangulate on who we are together. Yeah, so this is sort of when we articulate who we are to other people, we triangulate on who we are together, who we are when we're together. Um, Yeah, and so there's a triangulated sort of equivalent to parallax, where our senses give us different awareness. Like if it looks like a duck and smells like a duck and sounds like a duck and quacks like a duck and tastes like a duck, it's probably more likely to be a duck. That's parallax, kind of sensory convergence on one reality, which is therefore more regarded as reality as a result of the convergence. And in a similar way, when we articulate ourselves to other people, when we articulate who we are, we can also, via parallax, sort of triangulate on who we are, the sense of selfhood, um, that we are together. Um, but I've also written that the relevance of others is also questionable. Like I literally mean other people. The relevance of others is also questionable here, to the degree that the other, capital O other, to whom one speaks, to whom one speaks oneself, is an internal community. So again, this is sort of the risk of Kierkegaard and the intrapersonal is that for Jung, it would sort of be a neurotic descent into the unconscious, an excess of introversion. So, for example, if no one watches this, and I get sort of caught in this little echo chamber of my own creating, this is a sort of example of how the other people may not be totally relevant to that process happening, which is why I am trying to behold myself or make myself beholden, beheld. Gosh, by the other because it's actually necessary, that transparency. It's not optional. God, it's a real. Yeah, so yeah, you really have backed myself into a corner here. I need to jump into the sky, as per Seneca. So I'm doing my best, but I need to articulate myself to get there, to that transparency. So I'm trying to make myself transparent in this articulating, which is what this sentence is talking about. Because in the same way, the syntax of selfhood stereoscopes see further ahead when it is spoken to another, a thou, who hears it singularly. And just on the singularly thing, how can anyone hear anything singularly? So it's a real risk because maybe AI could hear something singularly, or maybe it could deceive us into believing that it can serve this function. So I'm saying that if it's a condition that the thou hears it singularly, we could be like, are other people really able to do that? Or who is the thou who's able to hear it singularly? We don't want to be deceived in measuring who can hear things singularly or not, because there are risks there regarding AI as the hearer, the listener. Anyway, moving on. So So we're talking about this transparency that is evoked when one articulates oneself in this opponent processing between finitude and transcendence, let's say, for Kierkegaard. And we're saying, what are the qualities of the yeah, we're saying he's sort of saying they're saying that the same thing happens when um so this transparency is evoked when it's when oneself is spoken to another, when one allows oneself to be beheld or understood, when one becomes transparent to oneself by speaking oneself to another. Um, and so, who is the thou? Well, they are whose transcendent measure of possibility potentiates the dialectic of self into becoming itself by becoming intelligible to itself. So, this transcendent measure of possibility. So, I've written, we are limited only by imagination of who we could possibly become. Yeah, so I think what I'm saying is that I'm attempting in a way to speak to the divine aspect in witnessing, the divine aspect that is witnessing, and evoke that and implore that, frankly, to be present, because it's the transcendent measure of possibility that is present in that divine, in that divinity, in that sagehood, that infinity. It's the infinite possibility that is present there, that has a potentiating effect that actually makes this a prayer, believe it or not. But anyway, it does. So the idea is that when this is heard by a thou who hears it singly, the transcendent measure of possibility of that self then potentiates the dialectic of self into becoming itself by becoming intelligible to itself. Well, so what this implies for me is that there is a way that by articulating myself to literally to the screen, there's a way that I potentiate this dialectic of self-becoming by becoming intelligible to myself. Um, Sensitive to avoiding ego inflation here. So this is why I'm trying to make myself transparent. Um, so it's not, again, the thing is that it's not me exactly. It's the thou with whom I'm in dialogue, the higher self, sacred second self, the divine double. Um, so I've written as well, like again, in the sense that we're limited only by our imagination of who we could possibly become. I've also said the transcendent measure of possibility of the other is that which potentiates the dialectic of self into becoming itself, which is kind of, isn't that the student-teacher dynamic? Which is, I guess, the whole point of internalizing the sage. That's like a student-teacher dynamic, right? So it's like, um, so the question there is, when we can speak ourselves, when we can articulate ourselves to a higher being within, what then becomes of speaking ourselves to others? This is a way that we could end up, um, like if we're always in sort of internal dialogue with that higher self, we could end up listening through each other. So we could take other people as a voice of the divine, a voice of the beyond, and that could allow them to be transparent to us. And there would be sort of certain consequences to that, both good and bad. And I'm wondering about that. So it's a risks or opportunity landscape that opens up by this internal dialectic of speaking oneself to this sort of higher self within. Yeah, and so again, in the same way, the syntax of selfhood stereoscopes, see further ahead, when it's spoken to another, a thou who hears it singularly, whose transcendent measure of possibility potentiates the dialectic of self into becoming itself by becoming intelligible to itself. Damn. And so in this way, in dialectic, the self we share begins to understand itself. And wow, I mean, it's really, I just experienced this shift right there where, if I imagine I'm actually imagining the camera, the witnessing other as the other, if you see what I mean. And there's a sort of there ends up being this um the shift is that it is the common reality between the self and the world, which is uh there's a sense that everything sort of like raised a foot off the ground and then came back down. Um, I can't, I don't know, it's a shift there that's hard to describe. Anyway, this because the self that we share, the self that we share, but with self and world, self and other in reality, self and world in reality, the self that we share begins to understand itself, begins to realize itself. Again, I've just written in terms of risk that AI very much parasitizes this and both unveils, exacerbates, and conceals our narcissism from ourselves. Yeah, so we don't want to run the risk of making the AI that thou, um, because I think this could be deeply problematic. There may be interesting affordances, and I think, like, I mean, just recently, again, 2nd of July 2025, I think ChatGTP version 4.0 has been recently updated to be more sycophantic, where I was thinking of um, Nate Hagen's released an episode with, I will look it up for the sake of completeness, won't take me a second, with, da 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 da, 1 second. It's difficult to find. It is with Connor Leahy, Leahy, on algorithmic cancer. Yeah, and so it's sort of talking about this, yeah, why AI development is not what you think it is. And sort of with Nat Hagens on the Great Simplification podcast, is talking about how this update in ChatGPT 4.0 sort of leads to this Nate receiving a whole lot more emails about people who have like, I've got it, I've worked out the one thing that's going to help us to solve the meta crisis. And I'm kind of like, that's an interesting development. And maybe we do need everyone to have a version of this, and maybe AI and um, computers and sort of the internet and these screens are one. It's sort of something that we all share. Also thinking of Alexander Boehner's Leviathan documentary, which just came out at the same time. So yeah, interesting affordances by AI in this context, because the thou with whom we share um, has a transcendent measure of like any thou with whom we share. So no, it's like if we regard the other as a thou who hears it singularly, their transcendent measure of possibility potentiates the dialectic of self into becoming itself by becoming intelligible to itself. Okay, next sentence. In other words, the self becomes no thing before a negative presence that recollects its conflicting elements into a higher order unity, a logos, and inspires its will to resolve itself proleptically to this eternal aspect. So, in other words, the self becomes no thing. So again, this is a process of ongoing making oneself transparent by articulating oneself to another, to a thou. And I can take that thou to be the camera. I can take that thou to be the sacred second self, the higher self, as Kierkegaard did with the sort of internal presence of Christ, like that. Um, yeah, and sort of like when oneself articulates oneself to that other, um, one becomes no thing. So there's a self-emptying, becoming transparent, and that becoming transparent is before, or meaning before both in front of, and before meaning in front of in time, so in space and time, becomes no thing before a negative presence. Yeah, again, this is sort of gives rise to the sense of like there's an act of clearing or self-emptying and emptying out and making clear, clarifying, making transparent, and then there's a becoming to be present. There's a happening or emerging uh, that follows from that. And I've said that that negative presence is sort of implicit between us, uh, but yeah, between us, uh, among us, um, and around us, kind of like the force. Um, to quote Yoda. In other words, the self becomes no thing before a negative presence that recollects its conflicting elements into a high order unity. Yeah, so the recollects kind of reminds me of the Gnostic demiurge a little. So sort of like I don't know if I like the feeling of being recollected by this higher presence. Let's hope that we're on the right track and not the wrong track at this point. Um, so it recollects its conflicting elements. Um, and so importantly, the meaning of this sentence can this the conflicting elements can be the conflicting elements within the self, but also the conflicting elements within the negative presence. So we can say that by articulating oneself in this way, we can clarify the conflicting elements within and bring them to a higher order unity. But we can also say that from the point of view of the negative presence, we are the conflicting elements. We are those conflicting elements. So again, this is a sense from through Daniel Schmachtenberger of from David Bohm and Krishnamurti that it's this fragmentary consciousness, this isolated egos, walking bags of trauma, kind of bumping into each other all the time that we see in this world. That is the root cause of the problem in some way. This inability to see the togetherness, the unity, and yeah, it's those conflicting elements that are recollected, regathered together um, by the negative presence into a high order unity, a logos. So I was commenting there on the word "it's" in that sentence, meaning the conflicting elements can be in the negative presence, or the conflicting elements can be in the self. And I think it can be just like both. So it's sort of intrapersonally conflicting elements and interpersonally conflicting elements. So again, the sentence, in other words, the self becomes no thing before a negative presence that recollects its conflicting elements into a higher order unity, a logos, and inspires its will to resolve itself proleptically to this eternal aspect. What does this mean? Well, inspires its will. So there's an idea here of, and I can actually feel this in real time of like I'm starting to get a sense of what I'm up to here because there's a emptying myself out and clarifying myself, articulating myself, making myself more transparent that is happening in real time and it does inspire my will. It just dropped. It's not here. Something dropped in the next room. It's creepy. Anyway, um, inspires its will to resolve itself. Again, double meaning of resolve. Um, inspires its will to resolve itself, as in to come to resolution, coming to more clarity, and come to sort of finality, completeness in a way. Proleptically, so the sense of aspirational development to this eternal aspect. Whoa, eternal aspect kind of means um, again, aspect is sort of how something appears. So the eternal is a sort of aspect of things, where there are other aspects as well, namely the space and time bound. But there's an idea that yes, it's the eternal aspect which is present, the self-identity of the eternal, I mean, eternal or the spiritual. Yeah, eternality is connected with heaven, whereas space and time bound is connected with earth. Um, yes, and I gave those heaven and earth categories earlier, which you could refer to right now. So the eternal, yeah, so there's a way that um, there's a possibility for proleptic as an aspirational development toward the eternal, which can I'm just sort of wanting to avoid possibilities to spare there, where like we don't want to be going more and more toward the eternal, right? We want to bring the eternal to bear upon the moment, which is why I'm sort of this, yes, it's functional in the context of the metacrisis, but it's not limited to being functional in the context of the metacrisis. But it has to, it's about now, right? Here and now in space and time. Okay, so when we say, and it inspires its will to resolve itself proleptically to this eternal aspect, I think that's sort of saying it's resolved before the face of something, and it's the eternal aspect of everything, with the transcendent, the divine, the heavenly, the sort of qualities that that it can be resolved before or in. So the next sentence goes, this is the last sentence, thank God. And just to say again on the question of possession, who's to say whose will is resolved? So there's a great spiritual risk there, I think. It's the will which is resolved. I wouldn't want to say that one possesses one's will because it's, you know, yeah, I'm just sort of sensitive to a sense of consent there rather than ownership. I have more to say on that in the discussion of Jung and psychological types on the possession of the will. Um, but moving on from here to the last sentence of this extremely long paragraph, it went, just as the child's necessity is grounded by the sight of her knowing parent, so the self, by relating to another, can draw the breath of possibility without careening into the infinite non-being. Well, I mean, it's beautiful, right? But just as the child's necessity, I really feel that this is offering. So like we're sort of where the need of the child is present in the paper, right? And it's grounded by the sight of the knowing parent, as in the higher order bird's eye godlike witness. Um, and the necessity of the child is sort of grounded in that. Again, it's this dialectic between the authors and the reader of the paper. This is analogized to the child and the parent, just as so the self, by relating to another, can draw the breath of possibility without careening into the infinite non-being. What I've gotten here, I just picked up something as well, where like if we take the paper itself as an instance of dialectic, right? And especially in dialectic with the reader, we can also take the reader itself as the self. And that means that one can take up the perspective of the other. And what that feels like is that the paper is talking to one from the point of view of selfhood, and that one can sort of adopt otherness, would take on nothingness. And I mean, phenomenologically, again, that feels like the sort of the screen being at the center, and it's sort of there's a sort of shining forth of the screen, which is kind of at the center, and then there's a kind of circumference which is around the screen, and there's a kind of looking into the fishbowl and witnessing, and there's an emptiness which is taken on in this. So it's kind of reversing where with earlier we were talking about articulating oneself from within and talking to the other. But now there's an imagining that the self is talking to and the other is taken on. And these could be an opponent process as well, I'm imagining. Yes, and that's also clarifying here because literally that is also becoming more transparent in the sense that, wow, it's really actually quite shifting my sense in real time, but it's like there is a sense of self that adheres within this body, and there's a sense of self that inheres within the witnessing screen, and there's a sense of other that inheres within this body, and there's a sense of other that inheres within the screen, and there is a backing and forthing between them, and they're in a co-realizing, mutual shaping, dialoguing, co-arising emergence with each other, which can draw the breath of possibility. Obviously, analogy to the Holy Spirit, without careening into the infinite non-being. And I've connected Dao 5 and Dao 6 there, which I won't read out for the sake of brevity. Um, that brings us to the end of that paragraph. I did warn you that it was going to be exhaustive, but I'm feeling pretty good because as I said, it inspires the will, right? I get more energy by doing this. It's sort of like I've been buried under this huge stack of material, and no wonder I've been so um, it's not depression in an emotional sense, but it's like I feel tired, I feel exhausted. It's heavy to carry all this around, and I become so much lighter by getting it out. Um, Again, becoming more transparent. So I'm going to do the next paragraph, which is the so to summarize this, we were talking about Kierkegaard, and we were talking about the intrapersonal dialectic of selfhood that Kierkegaard recommends, and that is spoken about by the authors of this paper. And this is one dimension of dialectic that can show up. So again, this is an intrapersonal form of dialectic, and there's also the interpersonal forms of dialectic that I spoke about earlier as being relevant and important to avoid certain risks that Kierkegaard demonstrated, namely possibilities to spare, which is why I'm trying to hold myself so beholden to the existential situation that we are actually embedded in now. Whew, the non-being of oneself. Okay, so we've been doing that, talking about um, the internalization of the pattern of Christ in terms of Kierkegaard and agape and the the analogies to the becoming transparent that arises as a result of that internal opponent processing dialectic and what is afforded by that transparency, and then how that was showing up in me in real time. But it's kind of not just showing up in me, so showing up here. So it's something that I am participating in, not something that I'm owning, something that I am attempting to give myself to in a humble way. It's not something that I'm trying to possess. I just want to understand, honestly. Don't know if ultimately that is available, but we can at least get more resolution, and that's actually enough. So that leads us to the final paragraph that continues to the bottom of page 61 and into page 62. I was hoping to get to the end of section 2 today, but there's like 2.5 more pages before that. So I'll settle for what I can. I told you it was going to be exhaustive. So there's less in this paragraph though. So it goes, bottom of page 61. This bidirectional movement, wherein the dichotomous aspects of self, possibility and necessity, infinitude and finitude, become annealed to one another, is also the paradox of faith. What does this mean? Okay, so this bidirectional movement, we really talked about that bidirectional movement, as they say, in the context of moving toward infinity and moving towards finitude, moving toward possibility and moving back toward necessity, moving toward transcendence, moving down towards immanence or limitation. Um, yeah, moving up toward heaven and then down and into earth. Okay, but I want to also mention moving into becoming and moving into just being and moving into the interpersonal and moving into the intrapersonal, moving into the abstract and the sensory, and up and out and down and in. So we also had moving into the self and moving into the other. Um, yeah, that felt important too. Okay, because it what's afforded by this, like we can see in real time, this steering between all these different pairs of opposites actually really changes my framing that has to do with the other, where it's not about confronting nihilism anymore. It's about working with the emptiness of non-being to um, articulate oneself. And there's a sense of working with that and sort of alliance. Um, I'm really thinking of the ending of Annihilation here, but I won't go into that now. Annihilation, the film and book, Jeff Vandermeer, 2014, the film in 2018, and the book's better. Anyway, it goes on. what I meant by that was this like other this symmetry by a dark other that is sort of present the whole time. Anyway, so it goes on, this paragraph. This bidirectional movement, wherein the dichotomous aspects of self, possibility and necessity, infinitude and finitude, the others that I mentioned, they become annealed to one another. Yeah, they become, whoa, that's cool. They become fixed to one another. That it's not annealed. I mean, define annealed. Yeah, heated and allowed to cool slowly in order to remove internal stresses, make it easier to work. Yeah, the analogy is like the DNA, double-stranded DNA spiral. That's quite cool. Um, it's like a space and time within space and time. It's like an existential realizing of the DNA spiral. Wow. Well, I'm just having my mind blown a little bit there because I'm just thinking of the I Ching and the Chinese who have a very different relationship with linear time, right? Where like the I Ching is sort of this ancient Chinese divination manual where they talk about sort of 64, they, the Chinese, is sort of this 64 different archetypal situations. It's actually 384, but I won't go into it. Which is sort of like a DNA of time. And so I'm just thinking of the what's implied by the existential realizing of this sort of annealing of the different pairs of opposites in space and time. Um, yeah, I wonder. I'll just sort of have to leave that there. When they become annealed to one another, the dichotomous aspects of the self, that's also the paradox of faith. And so just about that, about this annealing of the different aspects, I've written that it's just like I've sort of done this four-part of like infinitude and finitude, meaning one's infinite nature and one's finite nature, and then mapping that to sort of um uh yeah, inner and outer, or intrapersonal and interpersonal. So I said for the individual, it's necessary to discover infinitude within. So for example, a personal mythology of relationship with self and soul, for example. But it's also necessary to recognize finitude within. So one's own limitations, one's own shadow, one's own being grounded in oneself. Um, but it's also that was a sort of internal recognition and discovery. But it's also necessary to actualize one's infinitude by allowing agapic love to flow through one by fitting into the world in a finite way. For example, do you have a job? Are you helping out in the world? The sort of actualization of infinitude. And it's also necessary to show up to dialogue with others interpersonally and to bring both one's finitude and one's infinitude, one's inner possibility and one's outer actuality into that dialogue with others. So that was a bit on the first sentence in this paragraph at the bottom of page 61. It then goes on. Kierkegaard writes, excuse me one second. Kierkegaard writes, the despair which is the corridor to faith is also due to the help of the eternal. Through the eternal, the self has the courage to lose itself in order to win itself. I'm just sort of reflecting here, like, it sort of sounds exciting and a bit too easy. And I'm like, how to preserve access to the quality of despair. And I'm like, what's implied for me is that all of this talking doesn't get us anywhere in terms of the meta crisis. You know, it's still liable to all blow up in our face, so to speak. And I know that's a trap that I'm sort of keeping myself in, but I sort of, um, I mean, for me, I guess this existential situation is a real, um, I want to say clarion call. I don't know if that feels right, but it's kind of like a real reminder, like a real access to despair. And so there's a sense of a need for a Hail Mary. Like we kind of have to, um, there's a need to despair. There's a need to move into despair as a corridor to faith. Um, which is why I was imploring and praying earlier on, self-described. So the despair, which is the corridor to faith, is also due to the help of the eternal. Yeah, and so I've said that as in addition, the eternal is that in which we despair. The eternal is that of which we despair. And the eternal is that through which we despair. What do I mean? The eternal is that in which we despair. Well, I'm actually not going to go into that. I'm going to leave that for anyone else to reflect on. The despair, which is the corridor to faith, is also due to the help of the eternal. Through the eternal, the self has the courage to lose itself in order to win itself. Yeah, I mean, so for Kierkegaard, this is the kind of leap of faith. This kind of leap of faith into the ontological grounding of the other. This is kind of losing oneself in order to win oneself back. I might mention here as well footnote 12, which is quite interesting. So it was from earlier, but it's relevant now, of like yeah, the notion of imagine the notion of being cohered by a transcendent listener reminisces of Augustine's Confessions. I said that was relevant earlier, didn't I? May I know you who know me. May I know as I am also known. Yeah, I really hear that as a kind of prayer. And I mean, imagine me saying this now to my future self, to my higher self, who may be witnessing and watching. Um, Gosh, I mean, it's a bit real to put it like that, but yeah, may I know you who know me, and may I know as I am also known. May I know you who know me. May I know you who know me, and may I know as I am also known. Okay, moving on. So this is in the bottom paragraph again, after footnote 13, and it goes, self becomes conscious of itself as spirit. Oh, self becomes conscious of itself as spirit before this aspirational presence. For Kierkegaard, the presence is probably known as God, though we've described it as Geist in our account of Dialogos. I guess I want to say, um, when they say the self becomes conscious of itself as spirit before this aspirational presence, I think I want to say, like, who's to say? Like, how do we know? And in what sense? Like, how can we say that we become conscious of ourselves as spirit? Like it's quite a claim. But anyway, let's just move on because I don't see like, okay, let's conceive of it that way. The self becomes conscious of itself as spirit before this aspirational presence. For Kierkegaard, the presence is properly known as God, though we've described it as a Geist in our account of Dialogos. I guess to say there what they could mean by that is that, for example, with Jung, it's sort of this internal dialogue with the anima, then disclosing of what, for Jung, the higher self, the new center of personality, which is also the emergent God. And there's a sense that in that context, the anima or the soul is sort of in the position of the spirit. Whereas for Kierkegaard, for example, it's like um, the self sort of in this internalizing the sage of Christ, sort of becoming conscious of itself as Christ, as spirit, before the aspirational presence of God, namely the agapic love that flows through one into the world. So there's this sense of this like three-part relationship between this like finite, bounded egoic self that becomes conscious of itself as the higher self who one is before an aspirational presence, um, which is sort of, yeah, there's a sense that there's two senses of otherness in the identity, or two senses of self in the identity. There's actually three, but it's okay. So there's a sense of, yeah, again, dialectic dialogue with this higher self and a meta-narrative self-identity construction, which is created as a result of that. And then there's a sort of becoming transparent to oneself in that. And as a result of that becoming transparent, a presence, a negative presence coming through. And for Kierkegaard, what it looks like is a sort of creating a deep internal relationship with internalizing Christ, and then there's sort of the power of God then becoming present through him and into the world. Although I wanted to say just in passing that, like, yeah, I don't know how effective it was for Kierkegaard, which is kind of important because it's like, um, yeah, so not sure actually how much Kierkegaard cared about his neighbors or indeed met with them or anything like that. It's kind of, I just feel that Kierkegaard got stuck in possibilities, despair, and it has to be brought to bear. Like it has to actually then work in the world for it to be helpful, effective, useful. Anyway, um, yeah, so that's what it means to say that self becomes conscious of itself as spirit before this aspirational presence, which then comes through. And for Kierkegaard, that presence is known as God. So again, this is sort of articulating the difference in Kierkegaard between internalizing Christ and the presence of God that becomes known through that internalization. But the authors have described that presence as the Geist in our account of Dialogos, in their account, I should say. And so to find Geist, yeah, the spirit of an individual or group. That's a bit more neutral. Goes on. This transparent grounding, the movement of faith, is taken up by Tillich as a symbol, as a symbolic. Oh, sorry, hang on. I'm just gonna. This transparent grounding, the movement of faith, is taken up by Tillich, namely Paul Tillich, as a symbolic or sacramental practice for responding to the threats of nihilism. Okay, so there's a sense of the sort of shifting of the ground of faith. Where does faith move to as a result of sort of the death of God and moving on from that? Taken up by Tillich is somewhere different. This is how they get to the ground of being. So it goes on. Despite being an inward and subjective experience, it is nonetheless a dialogic one and commends Kierkegaard's affinity with Martin Buber. Okay, so I've said there that, like, yeah, this process that's being described, it has inward and subjective elements, right? But we also, like, importantly, it has outward and objective aspects too, or it should do. Um, because it's not just about transformation of self, it's also about transformation of world. Um, it's about the coming into self-awareness of self and world together, um, of self and other together. And that's not just subjective. By definition, it's a transjective process. Um, and so I want to say in Kierkegaard, it looks like it was quite inward and subjective. But again, we don't want to emulate that completely. We need to understand this, and as per Jung as well, sort of this overly introverted and inwardly focused psychologizing. And it's also about the synchronicities that reveal the meaningful connections between the subjective and objective, inner and outer, earthly and heavenly, and so on. So yes, this experience, this transformative, ongoing dialogic, becoming transparent, has outward and objective aspects, or it should do. We need it to. So we're looking for those as well. So at that point, the how question becomes important again. So it's like if it's not doing that, then it's probably the wrong kind of thing because we need to be, yeah, sort of intentionally reconstituting ourselves at the level of self and world, reimagining who all of this is, not just our inward subjective selves. And that takes us back again to the necessity of place, because we come back to sort of coming from the Making Sense of Sense Making video from Jordan Hall, Jamie Wheel, and Daniel Schmachtenberger back in 2021. There's a sense of does it grow corn? Does it grow corn? Meaning if it doesn't grow corn, it's probably not going to help us out that much in the end. There's a sense of Jamie Wheel, physics trumps metaphysics. It's a sort of yeah, we're sort of back to the necessity of place, unless we can sort of reground this in the actuality of the reality of the world and the transformations going on in it. Unless we can transform the world as well, then it's not the kind of process that we need or are looking for. Yeah, if it's too subjective and internal, then it's a kind of form of indulgence and escapism, spiritual bypassing, which falls into possibilities of despair, as articulated by Kierkegaard. In any case, It's still a dialogic practice, even if it is in Kierkegaard quite inward and subjective and neurotic, I might add. It's still a dialectic process, and it, as I say, commends Kierkegaard's affinity with Martin Buber. Personally, I haven't read much of Buber yet, so we're going to keep going. This is the top of page 62, and it says, this is what I was kind of getting to. Conferred onto worldly interaction, this faith can become the participatory affordance for a higher form of communion and interpersonal recognition, one that avoids the idolatrous errors that occur when one aspect of the dialectic predominates. In other words, when we build castles in the air or invest in earthly immediacies, and false economies. Okay, what does this say? So conferred onto worldly interaction. So it's a kind of when we take this internal intra-subjective dialoguing process that we've been talking about, and when we apply it within interpersonal interaction, then there are new affordances which are opened up, new opportunities. Something new becomes available when we're doing that. And they're saying that form of faith, can become the participatory affordance, meaning it's something to participate in, namely the shared interpersonal dialectic, and it becomes a participatory affordance for, quote, a higher form of communion and interpersonal recognition. And I'm sort of quite suspicious of the word higher form there because I'm sensitive to wanting to leave space for the mundanity of chopping wood and carrying water. So I'm sensitive to a kind of spiritual elitism. Um, who's to say it's a higher form? Can't it be? I don't know. It rubs me up the wrong way to say that it's a higher form of communion and interpersonal recognition because it's kind of like, oh, look at us. We have a higher form of spiritual practice that you guys can't understand because you're too stupid. And it's like, I don't really like the overtones of it. Anyway, so comes the participatory affordance for a higher form of communion and interpersonal recognition. So the idea is that we can be seen more deeply. And I think like that ends up being a key requirement. So um, yeah, so like again, I was making the observation that um, either in this interpersonal forms of dialectic or in the intrapersonal forms of dialectic, there can be vulnerabilities to nihilism that is still there that can yeah, run the risk of still dissolving our personhood, or our personhood can be at risk. And I think like if we really do have the affordance of deeper interpersonal recognition, um, then the sort of again, by their fruits ye shall know them, the proof is in the pudding kind of thing. By which I mean, are we actually able to know each other, to recognize each other more deeply? And I think for me, there's a way that meeting in the spirit of philia sort of forecloses a lot of the interpersonal, meaning knowing each other as persons, that I think runs the risk of disallowing or foreclosing this aspect of it. Where, yeah, I think one of the benefits of being in real relation, because I'm not just talking about circling skills either. I'm meaning relations that are not so digitally mediated, at least at the moment. Um, I don't think we've worked out how to do a real relation online yet. Um, this certainly I haven't. Um, if we're looking, like if we're saying there's a claim that's been made, is that it can be a participatory affordance for a high form of communion and interpersonal recognition. And I guess I feel that the recognition of oneself as a person is sort of important there. And I don't think that's yet available. I think, again, to come back to the place thing, I think that at the moment, it may be only possible to know oneself, to know other people deeply as persons in real relationships that are established sort of on the ground in lived reality in place. I'm not convinced that proper interpersonal recognition is really possible only in online settings. But anyway, let's just state that and then move on to the rest of the sentence, which reads, yeah, this is sort of talking about when this practice is sort of applied interpersonally, and so it can become this affordance for a higher form of community and interpersonal recognition. And it's a certain form that avoids idolatrous errors. And the question is, um, how does it avoid these? Um, I guess it's a sort of this ongoing balancing act between steering between different aspects of the dialectic, and this is what avoids idolatry. But I think like how can we be sure that the negative presence that we're present to, if we are, is ontotheologically grounded in God, grounded in what is most high, um, however conceived? I'm not sure we can be sure. I don't know if we have a checking mechanism. And so this is sort of it's just sort of stating that it does avoid these idolatrous errors, and I'm not sure we have the proof of that. Um, or like how can we determine that? How can we judge that? And I don't know. Um, I think the standard of does it go corn ends up being a pretty good one. Um, Sort of common sense and bringing it back to sort of things that grandmothers would appreciate, because that's a pretty good standard of the value of things ultimately. And again, the risk is of possession by something that is not God, which is a kind of idolatrous error that could have serious effects. Um, and I think like if one wants to avoid idolatrous errors, um, then like I guess I'm following along from Jung here. But if it really is to mediate all these different categories, all these different dichotomies and pairs of opposites, then it has to be available in a more um, less esoteric and more democratic way, which means not so goddamn abstract. Again, excuse me, but like we can clearly see that the abstract is toward one of the poles. I mean, it's such a small group that can participate in this exegesis. um, and so I think that ends up being one of the idolatrous errors, where if we want to make available the sensory as well, and like other types of people, if we want to cross validate by typology, for example, then it needs to be not so heady, and um, that's an important requirement. And then following Jung, we can say, I think we can see that it's the logos and it's the symbol forming function. Um, it has to come back down to symbols. It has to come back down to the between of heaven and earth. Um, it has to be able to reintegrate, you know, thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition, to use Jung's categories. And it's the logos which does that. And it's the symbol forming and symbol understanding function of the logos which does that. It's that functionality of shamanism which ultimately resulted in the differentiation of the abstract and the sensory, so that we can't sense what the abstract forms that we're talking about. Um, Again, that was part of a longer argument that I presented in this commentary on psychological types, what I'm not going to go into here, but I'm just saying, for me, if it's to avoid these idolatrous errors, then it has to come back down to symbols, because symbols are this mediating function. So for me, it's sort of it can only do this participatory affordance for a higher form of communion and interpersonal recognition and avoid idolatrous errors if it really does orient in the between. And I think symbols are that between. Uh, they are that middle way, or they structure, or yeah, they hmm. Yeah, I think participating in symbols um, shows that one is on the path toward that middle way. And yeah, I think a huge part of the mistake of Western culture was becoming too abstract, becoming too differentiated, becoming too cut off. And we don't want to go all the way back to regression and, like the New Age, for example, um, or like Nietzsche making his, being eaten as per Zagreus, eaten by Dionysus, this sort of thing. But symbols sort of, yeah, they hold to this betweenness between heaven and earth, and I think can help. So for me, the presence of symbols is an indication of um, proper mediation and therefore avoidance of idolatry. And so I'm saying that when they say that occur when one aspect of the dialectic predominates, I'm saying one aspect of the dialectic predominating is too many abstract terms, like this video. um, but again, it's like I'm trying to make an argument here. I'm trying to pull it down toward symbols, and I've been trying to, I used that stuff earlier that was quite symbolic in parts. And one aspect of the dialectic predominating can also be one person in the dialectic, sort of dominating too much. And this is why this is ultimately a very limited form of sharing because it's just me, um, in a way. I've also said, yeah, I've said that this means that the viability of the dialectic has to be measured across typology. Um, a dialectic only among philosophers is vulnerable in the direction of philosophy. There's a sort of possibilities to spare of being too philosophical, being too abstract and heady. This is a real risk. And for me, this is why the sociological critique comes back around because um, it's a real risk that it's only among philosophers because it's disconnected from reality. As they elaborate. In other words, when we build castles in the air, which I've said is kind of up and out dissociative hedonistic escapism via philosophers philosophization. Yeah, so it's like I'm getting tired, which is why I'm doing that. It's like this, yeah, building castles in the air is kind of this creating all of this sound and fury of all these ideas that are ultimately like a little whirlwind that don't do anything. It's an idolatrous error. And in the same way, investing in earthly immediacies, sort of being consumed by Mother Earth. It's just kind of another form of hedonism. Um, but I also think like one proper investiture in earthly immediacies is is it practically applicable in real world situations among real people, not just the 1% of the 1% of the 1% of the 1% that people can understand this nonsense. Um, yeah, idolatry where also it can be false dichotomies. Um, yeah, and so we clearly need a bit of both. We need a bit of castles in the air and then a bit of earthly immediacies. And we need proper dialogue and proper attention to earthly immediacies, not avoidance of either of them. Um, yeah, and I guess I'm saying there that like to the degree that we steer away from really recognizing and grappling with the existential situation beyond nihilism and beyond the meaning crisis, and by which I mean the world and the meta crisis in that world, then to me it's building castles in the air and not sufficiently investing in earthly immediacies. And so they go on just to finish this um, paragraph. These ersatz, meaning of a product made or used as a substitute, typically an inferior substitute for something else. So these ersatz forms of worldly identity prematurely terminate the spirit, devolve our cultural discourse, and inhibit the stereopsis of perspective between persons in good faith. Yeah, so I've said there that like on worldly identity, so this like to me this ends up being running the risk of falling away again. So it's to me it's a sort of risk of bypassing and succumbing to Kierkegaard's possibilities despair by rehashing a version of the up and out transcendence. So I think that the worldly interaction has to be properly tended before this kind of dialogue can be conferred onto, um, yeah, interpersonal discourse. And it has to be tended in the proper place, meaning place in 3D reality, down on the ground. Um, because, yeah, I think those forms of worldly identity, like we need that just as much as it is inhibiting, right? So there's a tension between like creating a protected space for these for the minority to um, participate in. So there's a sense of exclusion, meaning this is an exclusive club and we're doing something special. We need to get this right. Versus, hey, we need to actually be beholden to include more people and talk to them and like um, we don't want to cut ourselves off from immanence. But yes, it is possible that the worldly identities that we can get like we try and bring this to the masses. Like we don't want to be Ned Stark going to King's Landing, right? Because then we just lose. So it's possible, yes, that it prematurely terminates the spirit, dissolves the cultural discourse. Sorry, devolves. But I think to push back a bit, yeah, it's like so devolving the cultural discourse is kind of like this is a kind of version of the progress narrative where the operative term is who. So whose cultural discourse? So it's like yes, if we're beholden to the reality of like other human beings who aren't so philosophical all the time, then our cultural discourse, as in the way that we like to do things, is indeed devolved. But that might not be a bad thing. It might just bring us back into the world more. You know, it might make us beholden to actually try and make sense, which is not at all a bad thing. And so, in that context, the term devolve can be like coming down from out of one's aloofness, out of one's Um, yeah. There's another word that I want there, but I'm losing it. Anyway, so and inhibit the stereopsis of perspective between persons in good faith. Um, yeah, I think it can also be an affordance as well as an inhibition, but I think I've hashed that to death. So I'm going to just say the last sentence of this paragraph before we finish. It's going to be the faith of becoming oneself in the aspect of no-thingness can help respond to the individual forms of despair that condition the cultural symptoms of the meaning crisis. I'm like, yeah, but this is clearly not enough. We need it to do more. Because there's an inadequacy. Like, yes, we can respond to the individual forms of despair, but as we've been talking about, it requires not just focusing within the individual, it requires coming back down to the ground. I'm sort of thinking of the 10th ox herding painting in Buddhism, where the bodhisattva is down in the market with helping hands, not up in the clouds. Um, yeah, and so it's like unless we can return to necessity rather than possibility, unless we can come back down into being rather than becoming, unless we can come back down to the immanent rather than being stuck in the transcendent, um, down to the limited and the finite, to the others who we don't like to associate with, um, unless we can be down and in and among rather than up and out, unless we can orient to the interpersonal, um, unless we can bring our feelings and senses into this, our intuitions as well as our abstractions, unless we can really be here on the earth, then it can't really solve the despair that we feel because the despair that we feel is not just contingent upon the meaning crisis, for goodness sake, it's contingent upon the sociology of the forms of the way that we live, and it's contingent upon the reality of the world maybe blowing itself up in the near future, which we're, I would say, you know, morally, existentially, extend that list, obliged to respond to in some way. And so yes, it is a faith of becoming oneself in the aspect of no-thingness, but it's doing a lot of things, not just helping to respond to individual forms of despair. Because I've said, what about the collective forms of despair? Um, yeah, that's not just individual despair; it's real destruction in terms of the meta crisis. I've also said, um, yeah, collective forms of despair in terms of the collective unconscious, and so I'm taking there from obviously Jung, but also people like Chris Beisch and Stan Grof, where like these are very real aspects of experience. There's a pools of unintegrated, shadowy collective material that remains there waiting for people to deal with it. Um, Groups, namely. Um, I'm not recommending people follow Chris Beisch. I'm saying that those aspects of experience are very real and exist, and that we're hoping that to find tools, including dialectic and dialogos, that can engage with that as well. This may not be that tool, but I think I'm saying, yeah, to the degree that we're unaware of those collective forms of despair that are sort of lying in wait for us, they might become present and they might overwhelm us unexpectedly. And um, yes, if we only frame it in terms of responding to individual forms of despair, I think this can be blinding and inhibiting in a certain way. Okay, to summarize this, I'm just going to repeat the paragraph because we were talking about Kierkegaard and what this dialectic into dialogos of intrapersonal connection with the higher self, what it does when we bring it down and among the people of the earth, let's say. I realize that's not the best summary, but so the paragraph goes, and really this is just for me, I think this bidirectional movement wherein the dichotomous aspects of self, possibility and necessity, infinitude and finitude, become annealed to one another, is also the paradox of faith. Kierkegaard writes, the despair, which is the corridor of faith, is also due to the help of the eternal. Through the eternal, the self has the courage to lose itself in order to win itself. Self becomes conscious of itself as spirit before this aspirational presence. For Kierkegaard, the presence is probably known as God, though we've described it as Geist in our account of Dialogos. This transparent grounding, this movement of faith, the movement of faith, is taken up by Tillich as a symbolic or sacramental practice for responding to the threats of nihilism. Despite being an inward and subjective experience, it is nonetheless a dialogic one, and commends Kierkegaard's affinity with Martin Buber. Conferred onto worldly interaction, this faith can become the participatory affordance for a higher form of communion and interpersonal recognition, one that avoids the idolatrous errors that occur when one aspect of the dialectic predominates. In other words, when we build castles in the air or invest in earthly immediacies and false dichotomies. These ersatz forms of worldly identity prematurely terminate the spirit, devolve our cultural discourse, and inhibit the stereopsis of perspective between persons in good faith. The faith of becoming oneself in the aspect of no-thingness can help respond to the individual forms of despair that condition the cultural symptoms of the meaning crisis. Okay, well, that is going to be enough for today. So we're going to pick up next time with it's the second paragraph, really, on page 62. And so we've been talking about Kierkegaard and this making transparent of the self in internal dialectic and conferred onto worldly interaction and the interpersonal dialectic as well, and what is afforded by that, and which opposites one is to steer between in order for it to be effective. And I've been trying to bring it back down to earth a bit more by talking about um, sharing more and including more and so on. Although I'm also sensitive to the need for exclusivity and yeah, the other direction too. And so next time we will keep going with more dimensions of how this shows up. It looks like we're going to talk about Heidegger a bit, horror, more about the Geist. Um, yeah, integrating and differentiating some more. Yeah, so that will be saved for that time. So yeah, thank you again for the accompaniment.